Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have a special guest with us today, Heidi Matthews. Heidi, I don't even know how to introduce you because when I was going to Toronto a couple of weeks ago, I went on Twitter and I asked the cretins, whose show should I do when I am in Toronto? And they suggested your show. And I went and I had an amazing time, even though on paper I thought it was going to be possibly a scandal because you are a feminist professor. You came out of Harvard. Who? Your bio right here, which I have in front of me.
I'm a feminist professor.
Oh, you want me to read it?
Please. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Research interests: international criminal law, law of war, international humanitarian law, public international law, international human rights law, feminist, legal, and political theory.
Yeah, it's an interest.
Oh, you don't consider yourself a feminist?
I actually think that's an important and interesting question.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
You have a podcast, Heidi Matthews On Demand. You teach at York University in Canada, which is a very prestigious school. And we had a lot of fun because I love talking to intellectually curious leftists, which if you go on social media, people on the right have this very mistaken idea that everyone on the left is an NPC. And I constantly... An NPC?
What's an NPC?
Oh.
I'm very uninformed.
Okay. Well, I guess...
Despite the credentialization.
Okay. So,
I'm here for an education.
Okay.
What's an NPC?
So you're about to get one.
Okay,
NPC...
I'm taking notes. You can
NPC
I take
is...
you seriously.
I had to explain this on the Joe Rogan show.
Oh, okay.
So an NPC is a piece of internet slang. It refers to a non-player character or a non-playable character. And let me give you an example. If you're playing Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior or one of these role-playing games on your computer system, right? There's in every town a store where there's a guy who sells weapons or armor, right? Well, no matter what time of the day you go to the store, that guy's there. His only role within the game is to sell weapons or armor. He's not a fully developed character. He only exists to serve a purpose, right? Mm-hmm. So someone on, I believe 4chan, extrapolated and said, what if most of the people around us are NPCs? What if they literally have no minds and they're just entirely functions of programming? And I think that is highly accurate. And the way you see this is, especially in social media, when people argue with you, it's not just what they say. They will say it in verbatim, the same terms.
Okay.
And you realize this is an entity, an animal, and I don't use animal in a pejorative sense, an animal that has been trained and is not capable or interested in critical thought.
Okay, so it's like a scriptivization of existence.
Yes, and there's an idea from both sides that, there's such a thing on the right that, these social justice warriors, they're all NPCs, they just repeat what the New York Times tells them. And what I beat into them is there's plenty of people on the left.
The New York Times is so committed to social justice.
Well, I mean, you don't think they are?
The New York Times?
Yeah.
No?
Oh, let's hear this. Okay. How is the New York Times not committed to social justice?
I mean, so I don't, again, I'm not into I'm not so much like a labels person or, so all of that being born in mind, right? So,
sure.
Institutions can have different identities and purposes at different points in time,
okay.
Right?
Sure.
And I'm not I don't carry a brief for anyone in particular in the media world, but I mean, the New York Times is just a rag for the mainstream, ruling class. Right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
So, which is not so. In other words, the mainstream ruling class is not in any way committed to social justice. I mean, social justice is like a really if we're thinking about it properly, is a really robust, social project.
We're not thinking about it properly. We're thinking about it in terms of how corporate America puts forth the idea of social justice in the sense of Starbucks telling its baristas it's a good idea to speak with the customers about race.
Oh, Okay. Yeah, that's not social justice.
Right.
Right.
But that is online what is kind of classified as social
Right.
justice.
But then that's a category error on the part of the people.
How would you
using
define
it.
social justice then?
Well, I mean, it could be like many things. Again, definitions are fluid, and I'm not, as I said, a labels person as such, right? So it's not important to me to set out like this is what NSJW means. I don't think the language of, these acronyms are particularly useful. Except insofar as they also serve a scriptivization. I've just made this up. It's not a word. A scriptivization function, right? So just as certain factions of whatever, I don't know, who are these people? Are these right wing? Because you like labels. Because I read part of your book, right?
Well, NPCs can be both right or left.
Right, but the people who are calling people SJWs, like how do you define those people?
I mean, that could come from anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, it could come from the left. It could come from the right. It
Sure.
Could, it
Well,
could come
not
from
really.
within. What do you mean, not really?
Well, okay, so let's just back up for a second. So I'm not sure that people who consider themselves actually committed to like a substantive, robust, intellectual, but also practical commitment to social justice would use the language of SJW.
Correct, they
because
would
it's
not.
come to be a pejorative term.
Right.
So in other words, it's come to be a stand-in for actually having to spell out what you're talking about in a given scenario, right? So exactly in the same way that people would be calling people apparently an NPC, thanks for the new lingo. I've never played a game in my life besides Tetris. And Dots is very good. But
That's more guy stuff. So Final Fantasy, yeah.
whatever.
You're probably playing with dolls.
Don't know. Whatever. My proverbial life. But like, so, again, not a judgment as such. But people who use the language of NPCs and also SJWs, like it's a way of not having to engage in an actual discussion about what they're talking about. It's my basic point, right? So I always get worried when we start labeling people, right? And you're right. You're quite right that people on all political factions will use labeling shorthands, right?
But it's also the point that the vast majority of people bring nothing to the conversation.
So you're really committed to talk. So what is it you call your fans?
Cretins?
And something else?
Oh, the haters and the losers?
Yeah.
Well, that was you didn't get that. So as on your podcast, I made that. You didn't get the reference.
Well, no. I actually had heard you say it before.
But it's a Trump tweet.
But is it? Okay.
Trump, the greatest tweet of all time was Trump in 2014.
No, there was a good one recently, but go ahead. Yeah.
No, you haven't heard this one. Okay. He said, "Every time I speak of the haters and losers,
right.
I do so with great affection. It's not their fault they were born fucked up!" ! And I'm like, this is the greatest tweet of all time.
Yeah.
And I will stand by that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I will stand by. Look, I think Trump is like a comic genius.
Yes.
I'm utterly.
Wait, so what were you saying the greatest tweet was that he recently did?
Oh, so what is the recent one? Someone would have to show it to me or you could bring it up or something. But the one about regarding like destroying the capital E economy of Turkey, et cetera.
Oh,
yeah. Anyway, but they're all in competition.
Wait, but you don't think the vast majority of people bring nothing to the table conversationally?
So I think people are trained and encouraged to be lazy and thoughtless.
Yes.
So we're totally in agreement about that. But I'm not sure it helps us to be, I don't know. I mean, I know that you're doing it ironically.
I'm not.
No.
I swear, I'm not joking. I'm not doing it ironically.
Okay, fair enough.
Because I'll give you proof that I'm not.
Go ahead.
If you're on Twitter or anything, you have to have a sorting mechanism to figure out who's worth engaging with and who's not. Just like in real life, right? You're at a bar.
What's
you're
your
at a party.
sorting mechanism?
If they are using the same arguments verbatim in the same way, this is telling me this person. And every filter is going to be flawed. It's going to kick out people you want and it's going to let in people you don't want. That's the nature of filters.
Right.
But, when you have, for example, I had a tweet that was a satire tweet of CNN saying what Matt Lauer's assault teaches us about Trump's America, right?
Oh,
and people were replying to that thinking I was saying this or agreeing with it, even though it said CNN : and there was a quote. When someone comes at you like that, there's no one there.
So, yeah, I mean, Twitter confuses me because, and I think we might also share some ideas about that. It confuses me because on the one hand, I'm titillated by it, right? So it's this like titillating platform that actually has the potential to do interesting things that most other spaces online or whatever don't allow, right? So I met you on Twitter, whatever. I met tons of really cool and interesting people and made connections that would never have been possible, furthered my work and my career and my personal life and all of that, which is like so highly valuable. It's almost difficult to overstate. It would be difficult to overstate that. But at the same time, as you say, there's this like sea of other stuff going on that intentionally or not does occupy a non-thinking, and worse than that, actually quite. And I don't like the word toxic very much because it's one of these words that has come to mean something other than what it probably, should mean if we were thinking about it. So, but I will say that there is something toxic about the way in which people on Twitter just become accounts, right? So no one is who exactly they say they are unless they've got like a blue check or they actually use their name like I do or you do or whatever.
You don't have a blue check.
No, I don't.
So you don't know the blue check life. It's legit. You get a special tab.
Yeah, I mean, I have a job. I don't know.
This
I don't
is my
need
job.
A check. No, I'm just not. You don't. I'm just kidding. Like, whatever. Maybe I'll get a check someday. Whatever. But the thing,
I'll make some calls.
Yeah. Actually, if you haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll get on that.
I'll take it. I'll take everything. But you know what I mean? People become accounts. And then those accounts become avatars of actual ideas, as I think you were alluding to, or actually just saying. Right?
Sure, but what I'm saying is there's those people who become their persona, right?
Yeah,
but there's also people who adopt the persona that's been fed to them by others.
Yeah.
Like if I am ever ironic, I will have all the boomers calling me a libtard and blah, blah, Trump's your president, get over it. But they're all verbatim. Yeah. And then you're like, what? You are some 50-year-old person who's probably perfectly nice at home, and you can't wait to log on to your Twitter machine and yell at these liberals and call them libtards, thinking, I don't even know what you're thinking, but you're not thinking. You're not affecting change in any way. If you feel good about yourself, great. Yelling at somebody who you regard as your inferior, that doesn't make me feel particularly great.
Yeah, it's upsetting. It can be really upsetting.
For you?
I mean, I find that upsetting to watch when people behave in just ways that bring out like really negative aspects of themselves. Like there's no in other words, I'm drawn to people who like you, right, are like curious.
Right.
Just there's like a brute value to simply being interested in discovering things and complexities, right? And so if you're actually curious, that means, like I just said, you're committed to complexity, and being committed to complexity means that you have to do work.
Yes.
And you have to have a bit of horsepower. And when you realize that you don't know enough, or you need to do some reading, or you need to like whatever, you actually consider it a responsibility to do that before you engage or in the process of engagement. And so I find it, it bothers me like on a quite. So people think that they also assume on Twitter that other people don't have like feelings. Sure. And people do. And maybe you don't. I don't know. Like maybe it falls. What is it when something goes off a duck's back or something?
Water off a duck's back.
Yeah. So, like maybe some people can laugh at it and just walk away, even when the person is doing exactly what you're saying. It's being deliberately unthoughtful and acting in such a way that they were programmed to act. That can still have.
Well, I think I was thinking
it has emotional resonance.
I think I was thinking about this week because I'm like, why does it not bother me even remotely? And I think what it is, because if someone comes up to me on Twitter, this happens like, oh, you're a garbage person who's ugly and you're stupid and you're this and that, right?
It really doesn't bother you?
And I wondered why. So I always respond with, I'm all those things, but I'm not wrong. So that's one. And I realized why it is, because coming from being a New Yorker, and going on the subway, you constantly have crazy people getting up and yelling. And if some homeless person came up to me and said, you're dressed like an asshole, even if that were true, which it never is, I still wouldn't have it emotionally resonate. My only response would be, I got to get away from this person because if they're comfortable yelling at me, I don't know if they're going to escalate, right?
Right.
So on Twitter, to me, it's the same emotional reaction. Some person I've never heard of has cast aspersions on my hair or saying I look like Jacob Wall. It's like, Jacob Wall's not ugly. It's like, okay, yeah, it's fine. Or like, you look like Trey Gowdy. I'm like, Trey Gowdy is not like particularly hideous. It's very weird what they'll throw out, and it's like, okay, that's fine.
Okay, that's
so
good.
But to me, this isn't a mind speaking. This is a dog barking quite literally the same psychological function.
Yeah. That's interesting.
I make fun of academia and academics a lot in my work, but I enjoy talking to you. What is it about academia that you like the most?
So I have to say the students, right?
What about them?
So having students who are at one and the same time really struggling with the material conditions of late capitalism, right? So these are kids that are coming in, often not kids, sometimes in their 40s. They owe a ton of money. They're paying like $25,000, but yet a year.
Yeah.
And yet they're still interested most times in ideas. And so trying to square that situation is difficult, but it's a fun challenge.
But it also must be rewarding when students who you've taught come back later and thanks to you, they've made something of themselves.
Yeah, I find it hard to take credit for students, but it is really fun. So the best thing is always getting like little handwritten notes. Sometimes I never go to my academic cubbyhole. I go there like once every 6 months, which is really bad. I should go more. But there'll always be one or two little notes that make me cry.
Oh,
yeah.
I like that.
I find it difficult, and I'm just saying this because like I'm like in the middle of writing a piece on the way that we think about creepiness and creepy behavior in social situations.
We talked about this
probably.
Toronto.
I've been musing about it for weeks now, and if it were like a person who is clearly suffering some kind of like mental disturbance,
sure,
it would be easier for me to say they are under the influence of something other than a mind that could get itself to think in a way that we would understand as like normative and rational, right? So that's different. For me, that's different. But it's easy to let someone who's like, having a psychotic fit or under the influence of drugs or whatever, to not take seriously what they're saying because they're not in some kind of rational, emotionally connected space. But when people are online and they're throwing invective at you on purpose, they're actually trying to be mean.
But
right? Which I think is qualitatively different. Yeah.
Like if I said something to you...
I'm not valuing it though.
No, but
sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Yeah.
If I say something to you, we're friendly at this point, right? And I said something to you that was hurtful, that would get to you. And if vice versa.
Yeah.
But if I said something to you and you're like, oh, he's just trying to be mean, I feel like that would resonate a lot less because you're not going to give validity to my statement.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's complicated.
Really?
I mean, but we know each other now, right?
But so if you don't know this person online,
yeah,
and they're like, I read your thesis, it's garbage. It's like, okay, like how is that gonna resonate with you?
I mean, I guess there are different like levels of resonance, right?
Okay.
So I think saying that.
Wouldn't you be like, oh my God, you read it? I mean, how many people are gonna read a thesis, right?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
No, I think there's also, so there is another element here that can happen, right? So it's one kind of occurrence when somebody is like acting individually in some kind of like lone wolf fashion, like just randomly screaming stuff into a void or a relative void. And it's another thing when people engage in like pile-on behavior, right? And so I think there are ways in which even saying something stupid means something different if then other people around contribute to and fuel the production of that pylon, right? Or that fury.
But if there's a pylon, in my perspective, it's even less effective because these are not minds. This is like a pack of animals.
But people are minds.
I don't think
choosing to behave like animals.
No. I think, I'm not joking. I think human beings are essentially animals. And I think a lot of our sociopolitical problems are trying to pretend that that's not the case. And animals can be good, animals can be bad, animals can be altruistic, animals can be cruel.
Okay.
But when you have a group of animals or people all yelling the same thing at you, to me, that makes it less valuable because they're not coming to this conclusion independently. They are joining a mob.
Right. But like that's how sociability works in many circumstances, right? So people, it's a natural reaction. I'm not a psychologist, but my impression is that it's a pretty natural reaction to be encouraged to believe that a statement is correct or at least is proximate to truth or correctness if many other people are saying the same thing at the same time, in the same space, using the same words.
You know what it is? This is one of the things I was blessed by going to yeshiva. I went to Jew school as a kid. Okay?
Genius.
And I'm going to offend some people, and I apologize in advance.
No, you don't.
No, not you, but the audience. Trust. I remember when I may have been 6 or 7, and the first time I learned about the virgin birth. And what we were taught in school about God is infinite, everywhere, this unimaginable entity. And then when we learned, and again, this is a kid, so I have a much more sophisticated understanding here now, that like, oh, he's that, but he's also this guy who was a baby and just like walking around. And that to me, from what we were taught about God, was like blasphemy. It was just to realize that like 90% of people in your country think this with a straight face. I was like, oh my God, no pun intended. I did not mean to do that. So for me, the number one show in America is The Big Bang Theory.
Okay.
So if something is presented as popular, that is probably an indicator that it's very far from truth.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
So if something is said by a lot of people, that to me is not an indicator of validity. That's an indicator of popularity and an indicator of people incapable of reaching critical thought.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. My only point is that I think affectively it can have an impact on individuals who are subject to it, regardless of the truth content of what's happening.
Sure.
And also from the perspective of trying to make sense of like how people relate to one another, human sociability, but also just like political movements even, right?
Sure.
You need to understand how ideas and people gain momentum in certain places and at certain times, right? And so it might be true that, you know, the whatever, not because I'm an adherent of objectivity, but the quote unquote objective truth of the thing, or even the utility of an idea might actually be quite low or hard to track, but could still be important from the point of view of galvanizing support for even, as you said, quite stupid ideas or non-ideas, let's say.
I'm just thinking about a couple of things that happen to me. First of all, when this happens, I always feel like Neo when he's fighting Agent Smith in the third Matrix documentary, because it's like one guy and they're all coming at him and it's like effortless.
Why is the Matrix like everywhere?
Because it's the truth. We're going to red pill
as
you,
opposed to shorthand.
As opposed to blue pills.
Whatever. Okay. So that's too many pills. There's a black pill I heard about.
Don't do it. Don't do it, Heidi. You don't want that. Put down the bottle. You do not want the black pill. I promise.
Okay.
And it's not to make your, whatever. So Donald Trump Jr. took a screen cap of one of my tweets and put it on his Instagram.
That's funny.
For days, I had to deal with people who, because they couldn't get at Trump, they saw me as a means to get at him and were attacking me, blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
There was no part of me that took that seriously or saw it for anything other than what it was. On the other hand, if someone isn't in a position that I am and they feel more socially vulnerable or more marginalized and then they're getting a pylon, it's easy for me to talk from my position. It would not be fun for me in that position.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, right, people do lose jobs. Right?
Yeah.
And they do lose social standing.
Yeah.
And they do become socially ostracized and they do, lose their husband or whatever, right? Like these things do happen. And so from that perspective, it's, there's an element of understanding that doesn't invest in truth, but invests in the fact that these social events have real outcomes for people.
Yeah. So tell me what your piece about
that was all very random.
It wasn't random at all. What's your piece about creepiness? Because this is something we talked on your show a little bit. Every so often, culturally, there will become a new stigmatizing label.
Yes. And
you use that to dismiss populations or people who have a certain behavior that you don't like. And it's instead of having an argument or a perspective, it's just like, this is almost like a warning label. I just attribute it to this person, and now my tribe or my group knows there's nothing further to explore here. And feminist is used in this way.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, she's a feminist. Okay, I know what she's going to say. I need to hear about her, even though feminism as a school of thought is extremely diverse.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the more absurd things that people do in spaces, right? Is to talk about feminism as though it actually referred to something discernible.
Right.
It just does. It could be literally, it's the most, I can't think of a more capacious, professional label for somebody. So at least you recognize that. And of course you do, because I know and respect you now. But I got interested in the way in which, this relates to the feminism discussion, right? Because in a lot of the work that I've been doing, my current research project is on.
Do you say project?
Yeah.
Nice. Welcome to America.
What? Yeah, no. Well,
she's speaking like us now. Okay, cool.
I do both.
Okay.
I can code switch.
Okay.
Got the lingo. Yeah.
Yeah, she said duck instead of loon.
I did live in the U.S. for some time, but I flip in and out those words. But I got interested in the way in which, but I just wrote behavior down with a U. So there you go, telltale sign. The work that I'm doing on Me Too and trying to understand how part of that work is trying to understand how actually this phenomenon, I don't think it's a movement. People who know my work know that. But so how this phenomenon actually gains traction and works in the discursive space, right? Which a lot of that is dedicated to public discourse and online content, essentially, right? And so it became clear to me more and more that it was exactly what we just started talking about. So this is great. It's a great setup for this conversation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My welcome.
You're most welcome. It became clear that what so much of the discourse contained was actually a really, really lazy shorthand move, right? So this affective language of creepiness, but which is kind of a subset of disgust, although it's a little complicated, but also language of disgust. So, that's gross, or he's icky,
weirdo,
or ew, or weirdo, or a lot, just stuff that is meant to say something without saying anything at all, and is meant to be enough to answer a question that hasn't even really been formed.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, So all the time you'll see, I see these, blue check accounts, whatever, if we're going to talk about that, we'll quote tweet or subtweet someone or something, and they'll just say gross, period. As it would never occur to me to utter such a nonsensical utterance, essentially, phrase. How could you just refer to a situation as gross and then also rely on other people to recognize the grossness of the thing?
Right.
So it's like we are all supposedly sharing this weird gut reaction, right? It's essentially it's your spidey sense gut reaction. We're all supposed to share the ick, you, gross, creepy reaction to X or Y set of situations. And so I just kind of got obsessed with.
Have you read Haidt's book on this?
No.
Jonathan Haidt?
No, I haven't read it.
He wrote The Righteous Mind.
Yeah.
And what he did is through his Why are you laughing?
No, I don't know. What maybe I'll read it.
This is very germane to what you're talking about.
Is he an actual serious person?
He teaches at NYU. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, but
it's no Harvard.
I don't know. People go ahead.
So
maybe I'll pick it up.
Yeah, he's kind of a big deal. Have you never heard of Jonathan Haidt?
No, I know the guy.
Okay, so The Righteous Mind, what his premise is, it's called How People Reach Moral Conclusions, right?
Yeah.
And what he found is and I talk about this a little in my book, he put forward moral dilemmas, hypothetical to people to figure out how they came to moral reasoning. And what he found was very fascinating and counterintuitive. And one of the examples he uses, let's suppose there's a brother and a sister, and they decide to have sex once, and they use protection, and they enjoy it. They never do it again. It's a shared secret between them. Is this wrong? Right. And people will say yes or no, but when he asks them why, they struggle to find a explanation for why, right? Yep. And so we come to the conclusion, then we find the moral reasoning. And then he found they would say things like, oh, well, they might have deformed kids. And it's like, we know that's not a possibility because this is a hypothetical. We laid out all the axioms. It's not the data is not in dispute. And what he found is that people discover their moral sensibilities along 5 axes. And one of them is hygiene/disgust, right? Those are the 2 poles.
Yeah.
And we use it in discourse. For example, how often you'll have the conservatives will talk about how these refugee camps are full of disease and how dirty they are. They're playing into this, one of those 5 poles. So when you hear things like gross, creepy, that is a shorthand to press that lever that we all have to varying degrees.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So so social hygiene is exactly it. It's policing the boundaries. It starts with the bodily, right?
Yes.
So this is very this goes back to Freud and before, but the idea that you want to police the space where your body starts and finishes, right? And your body finishes and the outside world starts, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then you want to be very careful about things that you touch because you don't want to ingest things that are going to cause you to be ill, for example, and all of that, which makes sense on some biological level, right? So the idea that actually it would be bad on a societal level if we had a bunch of people living in a space where cholera was festering.
Sure.
Right? That would be objectively bad. But then all of a sudden that gets bootstrapped up into this purely moral form of argumentation. Yeah.
And we see another example of this, like Times Square, Pride Month, right? Rainbow flags everywhere. But if you had things like actual, even soft core gay pornography, like just 2 men making out, this would have a complete different reaction, even though what when you're talking about gay pride, what do you think you're talking about? Going to see musicals?
We're talking about love.
Right. Well, you're also talking about
Love,
intimacy.
man.
And,
it's just about the ability to get married and have kids.
Yeah, some platonic, right? So some platonic thing,
Just
and
everyone
no
can
one's
be in
fucking
a
each other.
sexless marriage together.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of very weird, dissonance where what you're presented is not based on, or they're trying to carefully avoid triggering certain responses.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. And I think so I was being facetious then, but the way in which, let's say liberal with a small L discourse needs to jump over the question about physical intimacy. Right. The actual question about sex and sexuality, or even just physical proximity, right? Like just bodies, frisson and touching and all this stuff needs to be elided and jumped over so that we can talk about, well, we need gay marriage because people should be able to love equally, right? When in reality, that's just another, it's a window dressing. It's a liberal window dressing.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where you could see the cognitive dissonance. Like if you ask someone who's one of these NPC leftists, do gay men on average have more sexual partners than straight men? And it's obviously yes, and it's obviously more power to them. Yeah. But on the one hand, they want to say yes. On the other hand, their brain says, well, this sounds like it's a bad thing, and they have their spurg out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely.
I make fun of academia and academics a lot in my work, but I enjoy talking to you. What is it about academia that you like the most?
So I would have to say the way in which it's allowed me to build a community of friends and peers who are rather sort of utterly supportive, right? So if you go through grad school with somebody and, you'd build their house for them if they asked you to, right? You're just unwaveringly committed to them. And this morning I was at this very New York, I did a very New York thing. I went to one of these workspaces where you pay $1,200 a year to have the privilege of 40 hours or whatever, how many hours you get to sit in the space and work with other people. But I was there with, colleagues of mine that I went to grad school with who are now professors. And it was just, an incomparable feeling.
So it's not this backstabby, shady world.
It can be.
Okay, but it could also
we reminisced about that this morning. We all, you tell your horror stories, but you know who you can trust and who you can't trust at some point. So those friendships are pretty amazing, actually. Yeah. Another thing that I'm currently obsessed with is it's just another example, right? It's illustrative though. When people engage in age gap relationships, right? And the way that's been something people have yelled at me on, if you want to talk about online yelling, I've been yelled at that a lot recently for just supporting the idea that it's not necessarily icky or gross or creepy for someone to have I don't care, 25-year age gap,
sure,
right? Why is that something problematic? And understandably queer communities don't want to even participate in that conversation because that kind of social liminality and but quite directly queerness, right? A queer way of being is just being different, being not within the norm, was so essential to the construction of what it meant to be gay or gender nonconforming or non-binary, whatever the fuck you're doing, right? And that's it's unsafe in a way to even have that conversation now, which is a lot gets lost. It's a sad thing.
Yeah, I also talk.
I find
about
that profoundly sad.
Vis-a-vis Milo, because historically,
right?
But historically,
exactly.
you had to have the older gay man initiate you into the lifestyle as a kid. This is very known in gay history and the gay community. Yeah. But when you present it in normal context, it's oh my God, you're for pedophilia. It's if this wasn't Milo, you would be attacking the heteronormativity of your perspective. But because it's him, it's oh, he wants kids to be raped. It's that's not what he's saying.
No, precisely. And actually, when I don't know very much about him at all, but I did go back on this point recently and listen to that little clip that effectively got him canceled, I guess. And I mean, it was a little weird in the sense that he was referring to younger boys, but that's also unclear. It's totally unclear what he's talking about. If there's questions, someone should have said, actually, what do you mean by that?
Right.
Yeah, but it's a perfect example, right, of how mainstream, again, I'm going to use the word liberalism, actually cottons on to, with respect to Milo, probably one of the more inoffensive things the guy has ever done.
Right.
Of all the things you could cancel the guy for. it's going to be this thing, you know.
Because I think that's the thing that cancels him with conservatives. Because when conservatives, conservatives attack political correctness, they hate political correctness. And I made this point when I was on Gavin McInnes' show the first time I was on. Every culture has heresy and taboo.
Right.
And you try to talk to conservatives about pleasures of drug use. You try to talk to conservatives about the police, the military, or you try to talk to them about children and sexuality.
Of course,
they lose their minds.
Yeah.
And there's reason for stigma, because once it does become a slippery slope, once things start being discussed and they become normalized, then that argument can be had. But the visceral reaction is most certainly there.
So why? That's interesting. So for conservatives, like Milo's a curious figure on a. Again, I don't know much about him, but from what I do know, like the fact that, he's an openly, flamboyantly gay man.
Sure.
So how was it that? So I'm just interested, like from just pure curiosity, how do you think the conservatives managed to square his just obvious gayness within their worldview, right? So how is it that they could accept as part of their own someone who was being very open about their non-subscription to a set of core conservative values?
I think the anti-gay movement is long gone among conservatism. That after the Supreme Court decision, that battle's lost. So they've kind of. It's funny because like if they cared that much about gay marriage, they'd be Roe v. Wade took place 30 years before that. They're still agitating about that. The gay marriage thing, even the politicians, they're like, all right, this ship has sailed. So. And there's also this idea that...
When was that decision, like 2012 or something?
It was fairly recently.
Something like that? Like within certainly...
And there's also, this is just my perspective, this idea that like if we don't allow... I think because homosexuality is so much more acceptable, especially among young people, if we don't allow the gay kids in our clubs, then we're not going to get the chicks who want to be fag hags, and then we're really SOL. And we're really self-marginalizing. Shit out of luck.
Okay. Okay, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so that at the end of the day, it actually is the female body that creates the core issue for conservatives.
Well, I think that's that. Am I wrong?
No, I think that's right. No, I don't. I think, I'd have to think a bit more about it, but that actually goes along.
And it's actually...
It makes total sense.
It's very funny because I have a friend, Brian Moylan, who used to run, I think, Next, which is the weekly gay magazine here. Okay. And I went with him to a gay bar. And the next day he had a piece about what not to do if you're straight in a gay bar. And I was like, oh, crap. And I read it, but it was all about all the crap that girls do.
Oh, of course.
And he's like, we're not your carnival. I'm not your Yorkie to put in your purse. I don't think you're fascinating or interesting. Yeah. Stop dancing on our bar. This is not your place for your bachelorette party. But it's just interesting how, from both perspectives, like, it's like, oh, we got to have the girls. So since they like the gays, we're going to let the girls in. And the gays are like, you know what? Why don't you just go with the Republicans and we're going to have our coke orgies?
No, I know. And and this may or may not be an unpopular opinion, but the degree to which gay male culture can be like overtly misogynistic is interesting to me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And also racist.
Sure. Yeah. Tell me more about that.
Well, if you're going to have sexual preferences, and since no one's in a position to criticize a quote unquote marginalized group, they're allowed to get away with a lot more. RuPaul has performed in blackface.
Okay.
So, like he's teeth blacked out, the white around the mouth.
But that's interesting.
But that's the thing.
There's multi-layered performance.
Exactly. Yeah. Sharon Needles wearing a swastika.
Sure.
Alaska with a swastika on her forehead. Sure. When you are, I make this point in the book also, when you're on the margins and you in effect have nothing to lose, you can actually be an innovator and reappropriate things.
Yeah, but there is like this deep envy of the female.
You think there?
Yeah, I do.
Let me hear about this.
No, absolutely. I think. Well, I'm trying to figure out what actually that stems from. So the great myth, not that it's totally a myth, obviously, but the great myth that is perpetuated, right, is that women are actually the ones that have penis envy. Like we're all dying to run around with a cock in our pants, right? As opposed to the idea that men are actually made deeply uncomfortable by women's procreative capacity. So a lot more can be said about that, but I think
you mean because like the afterbirth is so gross? What is that thing?
I've not experienced one yet, but I'm looking forward to the day.
What is this?
That's going to be awesome.
It's like a peanut butter and jelly.
Why have you eaten one?
No, I don't even want to see one. Yeah. I know they eat it because they listen to Ricki Lake and they're like, oh, I'm one with the earth now. It's like, it's great. Just go eat your dirt like pica people.
But This, you know, and I say this because based on a fairly recent experience I had. So this is anecdotal, but interesting from that perspective because we're having a conversation. I was at my law school has it's actually really generally an interesting.
You mean York?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I teach at Osgoode Hall, but it's at York, and they have a fundraiser every year. That's a drag show that's put on, and it's actually a fundraiser that supports a scholarship that's named after a former student who ended up. She's a former sex worker and a homeless person, and ended up being murdered.
Oh.
And it was a really awful story, and because she had, you know, persevered and got into law school, and then anyway, it's this dreadful. It's a really, really dreadful.
Yeah,
story.
when people talk about marginalization, that's what marginalization is.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, you know, whatever. It's like, yeah,
no, there's
that's marginalization.
people going through a lot
Yeah.
out there. And anyway, so they do. It became something that the queer students. One of the queer students associations had, for whatever reason, historically taken on this fundraising event, and it became this drag show thing. And in general, it was actually quite cool. And like the whole school gets into it. A lot of the professors participate and get dressed up and whatever. And I've gone to it a few times now, but last year was a really bizarre experience because I showed up, I was having a good time. And then the performers, one of them in particular, all of a sudden started launching into this diatribe about how gross pussies are and why would anyone want one, and aren't they disgusting, and, you know, fellas come to the front and ladies step back and all this stuff, like totally out of nowhere, like, and no one really knew how to react, and
Yeah.
I was utterly like speechless at this point. And it was so, yeah, it's something I've been puzzling through as a discrete experience, but also something I think that.
Oh, I can tell you what that was last year.
Yeah, I think, yeah. It was
Do you know
about a
why
year
that
ago.
happened?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because Drag Race has become Disneyfied.
Okay, yeah.
And now,
I haven't seen it in a while.
So now all the drag queens or the hardcore ones are trying to reclaim their culture and be like, this isn't for kids. And this isn't like, oh, it's like, hey, I'm a girl, I'm in drag. Bitch, you are not. And I think that's what it comes from. They despise the corporatization and commodization of drag.
Yeah, but what does that have to do with pussies being
because they're trying to be antagonistic and very much create a boundary.
Okay.
This is for us.
An edge space.
Yeah,
Okay,
and this is not for you.
Right.
And we're
It's not for your enjoyment.
It's not for this is not your house.
Yeah.
And we're going to be intentionally, I don't want to say provocative or offensive, but intentionally like hostile.
Yeah.
Because this is not for you.
It was violent, like, and I don't use that word often either, but it was a fairly violent expression.
Get it through your head. You're here as a guest and not a roommate.
Right.
And I think
meanwhile, they're being hired to perform.
Sure, but I think
I get it.
You see this a lot if you go to like a gay bar and like there's chicks there. It's like, why are you here? Like, you have your own spaces. Why are you coming to our space?
Yeah. So did you see this piece? That's really fascinating. Did you see this piece? I can't for the life of me remember where it was, but it was in a big publication anyway. A couple of months ago. Written by Black women. I can't remember the author's name. I don't remember. I can't remember.
Zora? Unless it's Zora, I'm not sure.
I can't remember like titles or names anymore, but really it was a very funny and well done but also harsh piece that was angry at gay men for appropriating Black women's culture, right?
Okay. So
no, but go ahead. Yeah.
Drag, like Little Richard came out of the drag scene.
Yeah.
This has been going on for a long time. It's a Southern Black thing, but a Southern poor Black thing.
Sure.
Like, these are the people, they were from the gutter.
Yeah.
Like, just absolute gutter.
Sure.
So there was a huge overlap between how the people talk on Drag Race and how Nene Leakes talks on Real Housewives of Atlanta.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the idea that, because it's so, intertwined, it didn't start here or start there. These are the people talking to each other. It's that drag queen comes home to his sister and they, have their little gossip, and the slang, slang is very hard.
I know, but if you see some 19-year-old white kid on Drag Race talking as though they're
they have no idea where it came from. That's
correct. But okay, so then what do we do with them? Because there's a profound irresponsibility there. Like, what are you doing? If you don't know where it comes from, then how can you, this goes back to our earlier question, how can you actually be performing a provocation that's real?
Sure. Yeah. You don't realize the implications of what you are saying. This happens in...
And you don't understand the mechanism of what you're doing. And not that we always have to understand everything perfectly, but if you're going to be a good provocateur, you better have some sense of why the thing you're doing should actually cause, offense or whatever.
I make fun of academia and academics a lot in my work, but I enjoy talking to you. What is it about academia that you like the most?
So I really enjoy having to explain why the way I think about feminism is related to drawings of vaginas, and in particular, Bauhaus vaginas. And so I have a Bauhaus vagina on my body. It carries together basically two triangles within a circle with a little dot in the middle. It was meant to portray sort of the difficulty of thinking about the female anatomy, and then, putting that in a really sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Fuck, I hate you. Putting it on my body in a way that was permanent and unchangeable.
Do you think Mies van der Rohe would approve?
I don't know who that is.
Isn't he the founder of Bauhaus?
Probably. I don't remember names. There's something wrong with me now that I just don't remember names. I'm sure I've gone to an exhibit, like in Berlin or something. Or probably.
You don't mean the band, do you?
What's that?
You don't mean the band Bauhaus. You mean the movement.
Yeah. Like the buildings. Yeah. The drawings. I don't know. I don't remember names. Very few.
Man, this ad copy really works for me. It's the holiday season, and nothing warms my heart more than when I can make someone feel dumb. Here's what you do. Mud water. If you go to mudwtr.com and use promo code DRINKMUD, you get 50% off. What is it? It's a coffee alternative. It's full of adaptogens and cacao, which means the highest magnesium and antioxidants of any food on the planet. No, it doesn't taste like dirt. It tastes like chai and cacao had a healthy baby. You guys know how much I swear by magnesium and how much I don't like coffee. This is a great alternative. A cup of coffee has an average of 100 milligrams of caffeine, and about half the population has trouble metabolizing caffeine. I think that's my problem. It gets me way too jittery, not in a good mood. This is a great natural alternative. It's got all these ingredients: turmeric, cinnamon, lion's mane. These are all herbs that help you with your day. You get focus and you don't get a crash. You take a scoop, brew it in hot water, and have a morning ritual that's more than just a vessel for caffeine. If you go to mudwater.com, mudwtr.com, and use promo code DRINKMUD, you get 15% off. That's a wake up for you. Let's get back to the show. There's a piece I read from a forthcoming book. I can't get into it, whatever. And they were making the point that the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in America played on the same situations that was fomented in the early 20th century in the South, of how black men were lynched and for allegedly raping white women. And I read this, and it takes a lot to offend me, and I was genuinely offended. And here's why I was offended.
Right.
It wasn't just they're making the case that Kavanaugh was the same as kind of this lynching, because worst case scenario, the guy doesn't get a promotion, as opposed to ending your life being in terror, being tortured, and your genitals cut off and your lips cut off and all this other stuff.
This was a big conservative talking point.
I mean, not to this level as I read it.
Yeah.
And then why I was upset is I imagined some boomer reading this and going online and repeating it to a black person on Twitter, being like, what's the difference between this and lynching? And when that black person correctly, or an ally, gets apoplectic, and like, how can you equate someone who's murdered and terrorized publicly in front, which is also traumatic for the town, by the way. If you have kids seeing someone being murdered, this is not going to sit nicely with them. And they're going to be like, well, calm down, snowflake, because they don't have the background to understand what it is that they're saying. Like, you don't realize what a lynching is. It's not just, like they had a trial and that's how they sentenced him to death. No. They went to his house as a mob and often burned down the entire neighborhood. This is no joke.
No, and I think there's a lot of so the Emmett Till story is really interesting and bears remembering, but in sort of specific ways, right? And so so that's great. So the big conservative talking point was precisely as you just illustrated, right? Some kind of like utterly absurd and banal comparison of Kavanaugh, to a wrongly accused like black youth. I think he was 14 at the time when he was murdered. But what was useful about partly useful about that sort of, not even that story itself, but the way it's sort of come to, well, I'll leave that. But about is the question of white women's role in unrolling the project that has become Me Too, right? And the idea that believe women is a sort of fail-safe, slogan or standard. So this is really complicated because on the one hand, it's clearly true that one, particularly white women, but all women and all people could have multiple reasons for lying about anything, including sexual assault, okay? That is just on the face of it true, even though it's an unpopular opinion. But on the other hand, to use that intuition derived from the Emmett Till story to then turn around as the conservatives did in that example last year, to say that Blasey Ford herself, Dr. Ford herself, was actually less likely or less deserving of being believed in the circumstances was a further layer of like absurdity, right? That just, again, totally renders banal the actual, as you said, profound suffering that took place with, in that place and time and with respect to that person's
Yeah, it would have made sense to me if they were like comparing to Duke, right? The Duke lacrosse case, right? Mm-hmm. That is contemporary. The consequences were far more finite. This is someone who was terrorized and killed.
Yeah.
And no one is accusing Brett Kavanaugh of rape either. Well, I mean, they had that Svetnik, but she wasn't taken seriously. But Ford specifically was not accusing him of rape. So it's even another degree removed.
Well, she was accusing him of sexual assault.
Right, but it wasn't literal rape. And this is a big distinction.
Well, actually, that's an interesting question, right? So a lot of people want to make that distinction, but not all legal systems do.
Okay.
So for example, so I'll use my home jurisdiction of Canada. Like in Canada, actually, it was taken to be, and I think rightly, an important, I'm caught in my own thing here. It was taken to be an important feminist achievement some years ago to move away from a hierarchization of sexual crimes, right? So instead of having a system where you're going to have like, the top of the pyramid, the most serious sexual offense is going to be rape. And then the question is, how do you define and defend your definition of rape? Does it have to be penetration? Does the penetration have to be of a vagina by a penis? Why would we, so you can understand how it all actually starts to break down at a certain level because you start having to get quite like granular and biological for not really a defensible reason. So the move was actually to say there's one crime of sexual assault. Sexual assault means an unconsensual physical touching of a sexual nature, right? And then there's aggravated sexual assault if, force and threats and violence are used, et cetera. But in general, there is one crime of sexual assault. And so that's understood to be quite a progressive move away. Anyway.
That seems crazy to me because there's not one crime of murder. There's first degree, second degree, there's manslaughter. But it depends on the jurisdiction you're talking about. Here, you're just taking the way the U.S. does things to be like the way the world does things, right? So actually, different systems have different ways of doing all sorts of different... I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying to me there is profoundly legally and morally difference between vehicular manslaughter and first degree murder.
Sure.
And which is a bigger threat to society and which is someone you can get over in terms like if I found out someone got drunk and ran over my friend as opposed to someone went to their house and stabbed them, these are psychologically different states.
Yeah. But so what you're saying, so in both of those circumstances, somebody died.
Sure.
Right? So there was a death.
Sure.
But the question is going to turn like the difference between vehicular homicide or whatever and like first degree murder, for example, is going to be a question of intent.
Sure.
So actually the allegation is that a different thing has happened because the offender in the circumstance had or didn't have a certain kind of intention, right? So it is actually a qualitatively different thing.
Right, but...
Yeah, and I'm just saying, I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but just to say that with the sexual assault question, you can actually manage those disparities. The allegation is not that every instance of sexual assault is the same. That's not the idea, right?
Okay.
The idea is that there can be, relatively minor compared to other more severe forms of sexual assault. And we might actually look at that in terms of the actual harms caused, for example, right? Instead of, whether there was penile penetration, right? Because that actually tracks moral responsibility in a more accurate or defensible way. And then you can deal with the granularities of the level of sentencing, right? So that means you could sentence somebody to, I'm not necessarily defending this, I'm just setting it out. You could sentence someone to 10 years for sexual assault, but you could also sentence someone to probation.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a foray.
One of your also research interests is international law, especially in the context of the Cold War.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why'd you pause?
No, it's an ongoing project and it's complicated and but go ahead. Yeah, let's talk about it.
So my background is also North Korea.
Right.
So this is a very open-ended, maybe stupid question.
No.
What internationally can be done vis-a-vis North Korea?
Oh, okay, that's great. That's really interesting. And so you just fill in the blanks here because, as you know, you've been to North Korea,
yes.
and I'm just not any sort of subject matter expert on North Korea at all.
It's the bad one.
Yeah, it seems pretty nasty.
Yeah, it's the bad one.
It seems a bad one. But that's great. So when we talk about like a bad one, so what do you think? So I'm just trying to map away into the question. So what do you think, when you say what can be done, let's first start by saying, what do you think the nature of the problem is? If you had to describe it, I'm sure there's like multiple levers.
Sure, the state.
In what sense?
The fact that it is the most oppressive and pervasively oppressive state on earth.
Okay.
Which recognizes no concept of human rights or property, and has familial punishment and has the most extreme punishment for its citizenry for things that no other country recognizes crimes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So is it a matter? So is this like a matter of degree, or is it a qualitative difference?
I think it's a qualitative difference.
Okay. So that's important, right? Because I know that you're aligned with anarchist ideas and thinking, et cetera, and the state is going to be a core area of concern for you.
Sure.
So the question then is not just the state, but the fact that it's, as far as you're concerned, like a very, very bad state, probably the worst.
It is the worst. Yes.
Sure. I'm happy to go along with that for the purposes of the conversation. So it's the worst state. It's doing really bad things. What can be done? So when you think of like things that could be done, what comes to mind?
No, but I mean, because of your background in international law.
No. I'm not being difficult. I'm
not saying you're being I'm just saying, is there a mechanism in international law to bring rogue states to heel?
Okay. So that's interesting. Rogue states. So the basic idea.
I'll give you another example.
Yeah,
North Korea at the UN was condemned for human rights abuses. Mm-hmm. And this was signed, this was accepted. And North Korea, they have something called the Juche idea. The Juche idea is the ruling philosophy of North Korea, which is basically self-reliance, but the word means smurf. It could be perverted to mean anything it wants, right? So you have Juche gymnastics, Juche architecture, and so on and so forth. And they say, we believe in human rights, but in the Juche way. For us, human rights means national sovereignty. Right. So when you criticize us as a country, you're violating our human rights.
Right, sure.
So when you have an actor which is not playing with any kind of sincerity with a straight face, again, where do you go?
Yeah, I mean, this is, you may or may not be happy to know that this is like the core problem of international law in general, right? Yeah. So, the thing, international law is funny because I think that people have this idea that there's something out there, there's like some kind of normative universe and also like machinery, like that they can pull down from like the ether that's like floating above us in order to assist us with these really concrete, localized problems, right? So, and that's just wrong. Okay, so international law, the only thing you really need to know about international law, or at the very least, the first thing is that it's concerned with state sovereignty, right? So basically in international law theory and history and also current practice, we look at states as though they are individuals, right? So the way that we look at individuals in terms of at least in the West, right? The way that we look at individuals in Western legal systems, is that the individual is the most sacred unit worth protecting, right? So like freedom, it's not just an anarchist idea. The basic idea is that freedom is derived from the individual, right? It's the core. That's why we want to protect the individual, because that's the only way that we're going to actually actualize or make real in the world something that we understand as freedom. Right. And so in international law, we just look at all these states as though they're individuals, which means we need to give them complete freedom, which we call sovereignty.
Right.
And the big conceit is that all states are equal, which is clearly untrue, in the same way that it's untrue that individual humans are equal, either in fact or in potentiality, right? So the thing you're going to be running up against always in these sorts of conversations is, at what point does it become, if we value the individual or the idea of individual freedom, where do we get off telling another individual how to behave?
Right. Okay.
There's no answer. I don't have an answer, but that's the problem. So that's why it's actually not wrong. And it's sort of in a sense, Putin does similar. He's a trained international lawyer, will make similar sorts of arguments that are actually really rooted in the core foundations of international law, the same international law from whence we get ideas about human rights. So, leaders of rogue states, be they North Korea or others, aren't wrong when they say we have state sovereignty. If you want to be treated as an individual that gets to be respected in the choices that you make with respect to your own territory and population and resources, et cetera, then by definition, you need to treat us with the same respect.
So
there's no answer.
Okay. One of the arguments I often hear against anarchism is I always say it would be like cell phones, right? Like, I'm on Sprint, you're on Metro PCS. When I call you, I don't know who pays, and I don't need to know because they've worked out between them. Mm-hmm. And the example I use is in contemporary culture. If I'm an American who kills a Canadian in Mexico, what happens now? I don't know, but I'm positive that the system is already put in place and that this would happen under anarchism. These organizations would work out mechanisms between them preemptively so that when this inevitable situation happens, there will be a path forward. So now that I have an international lawyer here, what would happen if I killed a Canadian in Mexico? And
that depends, actually.
Okay.
So there are different ways. Tell me if this has just become too granular and you want to pull back, okay?
Okay.
But the basic question there is what we call jurisdiction, right? So jurisdiction just means who is authorized to do what, when, and where, to whom, right? So there are different heads of jurisdiction. There's territorial jurisdiction, there's subject matter jurisdiction, and there's personal jurisdiction. So, but always the most important thing, and again, I'm not justifying any of this, the laws can all be redesigned if we wanted to, right? You could scratch it all and start again. But what we have is a certain way of thinking about things that privileges territorial jurisdiction for a lot of the reasons that I just mentioned, right? So we're very concerned, again, individual humans are concerned with their corporeality, right? So their body. Right. The body of the person is sacred. You transpose that to the state, right? Because once again, states are individuals under international law. The state's body is very important. It's the most important. It's not the only thing, but it's the most important thing to its own self-definition and self-actualization in the world. What does that mean? It means their territory, right? So the land that they have control over. So that means that territorial jurisdiction is the most important head of jurisdiction, which means that where a crime happens, right? So where the person is killed is going to be probably, there are always amendments to all of this, exceptions, et cetera, but probably the most or the strongest basis for doing anything.
Oh, okay.
So if you an American kill me, a Canadian in Mexico City, then it's going to be up to Mexico first and foremost to decide what to do. Why? Because the harm took place on its territory. So its body essentially has been harmed, and it gets then to vindicate that harm in whatever way it judges fit, right? So that, again, respecting the sovereignty of Mexico.
So what usually happens in that case?
So, well, now Mexico is a
Maybe not Mexico. Maybe some.
No, it's an interesting question, right? Because it depends on local dynamics and strength of governments, and contending normative orders, right? So, we all know that there are contending forces for power within Mexico, but it would be up to the state to prosecute a crime that happened on its territory. Now, there are also extradition treaties. Sometimes it's possible to prosecute, for example, your own nationals when they do things abroad. So that's generally an exception.
Okay.
But it's possible that the U.S. could, for whatever reason, get very interested in the fact that you killed me in Mexico City and could actually say, no, we're going to bring you to trial at home on the basis that you're an American citizen who did a wrong, and that wrong is still criminal in the U.S., even though it happened somewhere else. So there are a bunch of different things that could happen.
Could I get sent to Canada? Because Canada's like, you killed one of our citizens, so now we want to put you on ice?
So let me think about that. Yeah, so I would have to look up the details, but in theory, that could happen also because the link then, right, is with a citizen. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Heidi, we're out of time.
Okay.
What has been your favorite part of this interview?
I don't know. I like it all. I think you're very fun. You're like just pleasant and, well, pleasant is one thing, but interesting to talk to. And as you said, a lot of people aren't. And I'll agree with you there. So it's just really a delight to get to know you better. Thank you.
You are welcome.